Topic 52B SecondWaveFeminism. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you'll need them to take future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to define feminism, distinguish between the goals of first and second wave feminism, name at least 3 methods and 3 results of second wave feminist action, and evaluate whether you are a feminist. As you've learned in podcast 51A and B, the civil rights movement during the 1950s and 60s had far-reaching effects on American life. Not only did African Americans succeed in ending legal segregation and securing civil and political rights through federal legislation and winning Supreme Court cases, but they also inspired other historically marginalized groups, such as Mexican Americans and gay, lesbian, and bisexual Americans, to fight for their civil rights. Women, of course, were also inspired both by the methods and goals of the civil rights movement, and will return to their own movement of the 1960s and 70s, known as second wave feminism, in a moment. American women had long played an active role in public life, most notably between the 1848 Women's Suffrage Convention at Seneca Falls, New York, and the eventual ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting women the right to vote in 1920. This early period of women's activism, focused largely on securing women's right to vote, was called first wave feminism by later feminists to distinguish it from second wave feminism, which emerged in the 1960s. It's unclear whether these early activists themselves would have even called themselves feminists, which Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines as the advocacy of women's rights based on the basis of equality of the sexes, since they did not all believe that women and men were equals in every sense of the word. Nevertheless, first-wave feminists wrote articles, protested in marches, and sometimes highlighted their other patriotic contributions as ways to secure the political right they sought. Once first-wave feminists succeeded in securing the ratification of the 19th Amendment, women's political activism waned. In its place, historian Susan Ware argues in Still Missing, feminists arose from the sphere of popular culture. Pilot Amelia Earhart symbolized women's physical capabilities, for example, while actors like Katharine Hepburn, wearing broad-shouldered jackets and trousers, played strong, independent leads on the silver screen. As these heroines of the 1930s gave way to real-life Rosie the Riveters during the war, women once again demonstrated their patriotism and capabilities at the same time they enjoyed the economic independence such work brought. Nevertheless, as we learned in podcast 46, women were fired when men returned home from the war in search of jobs. For the middle class, post-war affluence meant that families did not need a second income, so popular culture began to idealize a new norm: father who worked outside the home, mother who managed the home and raised the children. Clearly, women's roles during the 1950s and early 60s were far from those of their politically active mothers and grandmothers fighting for women's suffrage. For some, domesticity was a blessing, but as author Betty Friedan found in The Feminine Mystique, many women felt stultified, anxious, and depressed without meaningful work outside the home. This book, published in 1963, was the match that lit second-wave feminism aflame. Women read the book together and discussed its implications for their lives. They formed consciousness-raising groups that met in women's homes to nurture feminist ideals in one another. Soon, they developed the motto, "The personal is political," to underscore the notion that how they lived their everyday lives could be a political act. Indeed, in contrast to the goals of first-wave feminists, the primary goals of second-wave feminists were not political in the strict sense of the word. Instead, they focused on a broad range of personal, social, and economic goals. The very breadth of their goals has, in some cases, made them more difficult to achieve and sustain. Listening to a few of them, for example, you will recognize that some have yet to be realized and others are under attack. Second-wave feminists objected to the unofficial discrimination that prevented them from obtaining jobs or, when they could get jobs, from being paid salaries equivalent to their male coworkers for the same work. Another second-wave campaign was the legalization of birth control and eventually abortion. Others fought against the hypersexualization of women in the media. Within this group, some worked to outlaw pornography. Other feminists, however, viewed pornography as a legitimate choice that women had the right to make, and so fought for women's right to be pornographic models and actresses. The disparate views of feminists themselves, as well as the backlash from men and social conservatives, have made achieving the goals of second-wave feminists difficult. Nevertheless, borrowing from the methods of the civil rights movement, as well as originating their own, second-wave feminists did succeed in accomplishing important goals. Journalists like Gloria Steinem helped spread the message of feminism through founding institutions like the National Organization of Women in 1966 and magazines such as Ms. in 1971. Now, and NARAL, the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League, founded in 1969, campaigned for legislation and hosted large marches on Washington to mobilize feminists and draw attention to their goals. Such methods succeeded in securing married women's rights to obtain birth control in the Griswold v. Connecticut Supreme Court case of 1965, and any woman's right to have an abortion during the first 2 trimesters of pregnancy in the landmark 1973 Supreme Court case Roe v. Wade. Second-wave feminists also agitated successfully for the passage of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbade discrimination in the workplace based on gender, as well as other characteristics, and Title IX in 1972, which amended the Elementary and Secondary Schools Education Act of 1965 by forbidding discrimination on the basis of sex in any educational program that receives federal financing. Title IX thus inaugurated a new era of athletics for girls in schools that has today borne fruit in the dominance of American women in such sports like soccer. Despite these successes, second-wave feminism experienced a backlash by the late 1970s that continues unabated to this day. In 1972, for example, the U.S. Congress adopted the Equal Rights Amendment that had been written by first-wave feminist Alice Paul during the 1920s. It read, "Men and women shall have equal rights throughout the United States and every place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Nevertheless, the ERA did not receive enough state ratifications by the 1979 deadline, and so the amendment died. By this time, prominent conservatives, especially Phyllis Schlafly, had begun to campaign against ratification. Though social conservatives and evangelical Christians have waged campaigns to curtail women's reproductive rights since the 1980s, there has been a marked uptick in state laws restricting women's abortion rights since 2010. Finally, the Me Too and Time's Up movements of the late 2010s highlights that even more than half a century after the emergence of second-wave feminism, its goals of social and economic equality for men and women has yet to be achieved in American life. Remember the learning objectives for this podcast. Write each one out in a sentence or a paragraph now. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives on the screen now. Good luck!